Psychology with M. Today we'll be continuing our conversation on human cooperation from last week, but today we're going to have a specific focus on sex differences. So to debrief you guys a little bit about our last conversation, cooperation refers to when two individuals act together in order to gain mutual benefits. So we can think about hunting as an example of cooperation in humans, and even in other social animals like wolves. This is a heavily researched topic within psychology, and today we will address the question of whether there are sex differences within cooperation. Now, to clarify, we understand that the terms sex and gender are two very distinct concepts. However, much of the literature in this field use these terms interchangeably or just don't distinguish them as separate. So for the sake of our conversation on this episode, we will take on the binary categorization of sex. That being said, research has suggested that sex differences in cooperative behavior do exist in humans, while others suggest that contextual factors are more influential and explanatory. An example of a difference was seen in childhood, where there was a study of cooperative social play, and the findings were that females generally start at an earlier age than males. Given the various stances on this question of influence of sex on cooperation, we are joined by two very special guests today, Dr. Michael Kim, Professor of Evolutionary Theory at Cornell University, and Dr. Kentaro Kaneki, Professor of Comparative Psychology at the University of Tokyo. Good afternoon. How are you guys doing today? Thank you for joining us for our conversation.
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
I'm a little sick, but I'm really excited for this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that you're feeling sick today, but thanks so much for joining us. Can you touch on a little bit about your expertise? Dr. Kim, I understand you're interested in competition.
Yes, I am. So I have two main research topics. One is on how cooperative behavior sort of exists and evolves within different competitive contexts. And my second main area of research is looking at how cooperative behavior is related to sexual selection and mate choice.
Okay. So, Dr. Kaneki, can you tell me a little bit about your work?
Yeah, I actually really enjoy looking at different models and thinking about which models best represent a specific situation. More recently, I've been using computers to create much more complex models of cooperation than the traditional models like Prisoner's Dilemma and the Game with Chicken.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Prisoner's Dilemma?
Yeah, of course. Prisoner's Dilemma is a model in game theory that puts two individuals head to head. And so the idea behind it is that you commit a crime with your friend and you're being questioned by the police in separate rooms. And so you can either rat them out, which is considered defecting, or keep silent, and which is considered cooperating. In this example, if you both rat each other out, you'll probably be stuck in jail, let's say, for 3 years. While if you both keep silent, then you might only be there for 1 year because there's not enough evidence to put you in for 3 years. If you defect and rat them out while the other person keeps silent, you might actually serve no time because you helped the police out and they appreciate that, while the other person might get 5 years for not helping out the police at all. So the best case scenario in this game is that you both cooperate, that way you both get 1 year, but you run the risk of the other person defecting. And this idea can be applied to evolutionary psychology.
So the Prisoner's Dilemma is a heavily talked about sort of context in this field of research. Were there any sex differences that were found within this context?
So a paper I was looking at was talking about how males cooperate much more with males compared to females playing other females. And then the opposite sex condition would be in between those two. So overall, males are more likely to cooperate, and they're also more likely to imitate their partner's last decision. And this follows this strategy called tit for tat, which is considered to be one of the best strategies for Prisoner's Dilemma. In this strategy, you start the game off by cooperating, and then for the rest of the time, you just copy what the other person did the previous time. For example, if I'm playing you, and you defect in round 2, I'll defect round 3. And research shows that people can actually be converted to defect or cooperate by the other person, especially males, because they're more likely to imitate the other person.
Oh, so this is interesting that there might be differences in the strategy that's played because of the factor of sex, huh?
I'm a little skeptical with all this data, though, because the data does suggest that females cooperate less and males follow this tit-for-tat strategy. But a lot of research recently shows that Prisoner's Dilemma is not the perfect model for everything, and that we also put too much emphasis on Prisoner's Dilemma because it has this historical context. I think it's still a very valuable model, but a lot of people think that to study sex differences, we should take into consideration social context and use much more complex models that take into account much more different factors.
It's interesting that you bring that up. I actually just read a paper that Brent Simpson published. He talks about how current research places too much emphasis on this specific social context. And he agrees with you, and he suggests that we should stray away from this classic example.
Yeah, I'm actually very familiar with his work. This is completely unrelated, but he has a 4 out of 5 on ratemyprofessor.com, and it kind of saddens me because my students don't like me as much. Dr. Kim, have you looked at your scores before?
Yeah, so I'll admit, looking at my Rate My Professor rating is actually one of my guilty pleasures. And I believe I have a 5 out of 5, which is out of around 260 student reviews, so I'm very happy with that.
You know, I was always curious if my professors at university actually read their reviews on Rate My Professor.
Yeah, we definitely do. You know, we don't tell our students that, but yeah. Anyway, we should get back to the topic.
Okay, so going back to what Simpson's studied, he was arguing that fear and greed are factors that influence cooperation depending on sex. More specifically, that females are more likely to defect because of fear of exploitation by others, while males are driven by greed and temptations to free ride, so they will defect. Although there were no significant differences between males and females in the fear dilemma or the prisoner's dilemma, males were found to be twice as likely to defect in the greed dilemma. So this study was particularly interesting because it opens up the conversation around the importance of contextual factors in cooperative exchanges. Dr. Kim, do you know of other social contexts that may produce sex differences?
Yeah, so my research again focuses on cooperative behavior and its evolution in different competitive contexts. And actually, one of my good friends, Bailey, in his lab, they did a project in 2012 that looked at sex differences in group cooperation depending on different competitive conditions. Mm-hmm. So in this study, they found that men tend to cooperate more in conditions of group threat, whereas women's cooperation with others, members of the in-group, were not as influenced by a perceived group threat. So the specific methodology that they used for this paper, which I thought was pretty interesting, was they have, in the groups, members are given a certain amount of money, which is their private money. And they can either keep it as their private money or they can invest it into a public pot. So if this public pot reaches a certain minimum number of dollars, everyone in that group gets a certain bonus. So there's an incentive for people to put more into the pot. However, by doing that, you sort of risk putting your own private money at risk and not getting a public reward if your group does not get a bonus. So this paper really did find sex differences in cooperation under group or individually competitive conditions. So this paper found that men's public investment was higher when competing against an outgroup than when there was no such competition. It was different for women because in the women, their investment was not influenced by the presence or absence of an outgroup. However, I will admit that, and Bailey also thinks this, that it's really difficult to sort of extrapolate to conditions where costs and benefits are much more substantial than just like $10.
Dr. Kim, that's actually really interesting because I was reading a different paper and they actually called it the male warrior hypothesis, where they just had, where they saw that males contribute more in case of intergroup competition. And so they concluded that while females don't really care about intergroup competition, males' behavior is influenced a lot by it. Another study was also talking about how males will associate themselves with other people who are in the same group, and so group affiliation is actually really important to them, while for females it's more about the personal relationships they have with those individuals.
So Dr. Kim, in this type of research, do subjects tend to adjust their levels of cooperation in response to outcomes from previous trials? So in other words, does the level of cooperation change dynamically, or does it pretty much stay consistent, and are these sex dependent?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yes, to answer your question, yes, it does change dynamically. So in this particular game that Bailey's study looked at, in general, there was an increase in public spending after a previous loss. Loss meaning the total contributions to the group were not enough to earn a bonus. And then there was a group decrease in such spending if they won previously, which means, again, a win meaning after a bonus was earned for the whole group. And this makes sense. After you win, you probably would put less in because you already won, but if you lost, you put more effort in, so you want to win the next time.
Right.
But the interesting part about this study was that the pattern was a lot more nuanced and complicated for the men. So men actually made a smaller public contribution in the group condition following a win, but they made a larger contribution in the individual competition following a win. And in the individual competition, in the individual condition, they did not know that they were competing against another rival group. So they suggested that men were more sensitive to perceived between group competition than women were, as well as to the perceived level of cooperation among other group members. And these results are really sort of consistent with other hypotheses out there that men have an evolved sensitivity to competitive situations and outcomes, especially when these involve between group competition. So if the outgroup is really strong, group cohesion becomes a lot more important, and the group itself must contribute more to stay competitive with the outgroups. But if they find that the outgroup is weak, they act more selfishly because they believe that their own contributions, if they're above anyone else's in that group, will not really add any value and not affect the outcome. So if we sort of look at a real life analogy of this situation, let's say you have two different basketball teams that are playing 2 straight games against each other. If you control for the relative team strength of each respective team as well as home court advantage, a team that lost the first game is probably more likely to win the second game because they increased their efforts as a result of their first loss.
That's really interesting. So what does this mean for real life situations? I mean, not everything is a public goods game, and not everything's going to involve money or investments.
Right. So to conclude sort of the study I was talking about before, males tended to cooperate more with the perceived outgroup threat, whereas women's strategies did not change much. However, the males' choices change dynamically depending on prior interactions, suggesting that they only sacrifice what is necessary for the group to survive against a rival group. However, they don't limit their investments when they are told they are not competing against another group. So to go back to your question, what does this mean for real life situations? Well, this may have very real life implications for behavioral risk taking, where physical injury to enhance group competitiveness is at risk. So I do agree with you, though, that a lot of these studies are limiting because they primarily deal with the small amounts of money and investments in a public good game as measures of cooperation, when we all know that it's very much hard to sort of extrapolate those to bigger contexts where costs and benefits of cooperation are much more substantial.
Okay, so far it does sound like males and females do show differences in how they behave in various cooperative settings. Mr. Kim, so you also study sexual selection. What are some of the implications of this on cooperative behavior?
Yeah, for sure. So cooperation is a very strange thing because it is not often economically rational, so there has to be some selective pressures to cooperate. And my research sort of focuses on the gap of the research. So a lot of research on this sort of focuses on kinship and reciprocal altruism, but not a lot of research focuses on this role sexual selection plays on cooperation, so mate selection, mate choice. So the research specifically by Ferrelli, a good friend of mine, and his lab, they did research on the role of sexual selection plays on cooperative behaviors. So through their research, they found that the costs of cooperation are not necessarily compensated or offset by kinship or reciprocation, but instead by increased mating success. So they suggest that people preferentially direct cooperative behavior towards more attractive members of the opposite sex. And in the same token, cooperation increases the perceived attractiveness of the cooperator as well. So with all this research, it suggests that sexual selection is therefore really considered an evolutionary mechanism that promotes cooperation.
Are there any specific studies that have kind of researched into this?
Yeah, for sure. So to go back to my colleague Ferrelli, in 2007, his lab did a research project on how sexual selection and perceived attractiveness of people affected cooperative behaviors. So in this particular study, subjects were shown pictures of 4 different people across both sexes. One was a male of average attractiveness. A second was a male with high attractiveness, a female with average attractiveness, and then the fourth was a female with high attractiveness. They then made a decision to donate directly to the partner or donate to a charity that wasn't going straight to the partner. So more specifically, in the so-called standard game, participants were told to imagine a certain scenario. They were shopping one afternoon, they found a $10 bill on the ground, they were going to pick it up, but then another individual walks up to them and say, "Oh, I was going to pick up the $10 bill." So how does the first person react and how much money do they share with the second person? That's the standard game. The second setup, called the charity game, was a little more interesting in the fact that it's the same scenario up to the point where the first individual finds a $10 bill on the ground, but then the second individual comes in and says, oh, I was going to pick up the $10 bill to donate to a charity. So in this situation, the first person has to decide whether to share their money. Doesn't go straight to the partner, but it goes to the charity that the partner was suggesting. So the research of this study found that males cooperated more with the opposite sex in the standard game where the money was going straight to the female. Females, however, did not cooperate more with males in this setting. It's interesting because in the charity game, both sexes cooperated more with females.
So it sounds like females are less affected by attractiveness?
Yeah, so it's interesting because that's initially what the results suggested, but they actually found that participants, both males and females, tended to be more cooperative towards the more attractive members of the opposite sex. And at the same time, afterwards, when they rated how attractive their partners were, it was actually found that more cooperative partners were rated as more attractive. So therefore, they suggested that investment in sort of this altruism of giving the money paid off with increased perceived attractiveness and consequently in perhaps mating opportunities.
So Dr. Kim, I really found that interesting, especially the thing about the charity game and how both sexes cooperate more with the female. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
In the paper I was referencing earlier, they noticed that both sexes cooperated more with males. So I guess that shows that the Prisoner's Dilemma is not perfect for every model or every situation, and we should consider more models, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
Okay, so what are some of the ecological implications? Can we root this back to evolutionary mechanisms?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have to, right? This is evolutionary psych. So this research really showed that sort of the relatively minor economic costs of giving some money away to your partner could really reap huge reproductive rewards in the future. So I know it's a little bit of a step to say that, but that is sort of what the research suggests in sort of these altruistic acts. It doesn't have to be money, but it can be some other thing, display of your abilities or your ability to care for children. These can all sort of act as courtship gifts where they evaluate how good you would be as a mate. So this research suggests that the actual gift itself, the $10 or whatever amount that was given to the partner, the intrinsic value of that is not necessarily the most important thing, but the long-term consequences of that, whether it be increased mating success, is actually more important. So they do consider that in an evolutionary lens, like you said.
Okay, so in these type of experiments, do subjects actually behave as if there are real costs and benefits, since there are no financial costs of operating this experiment?
Yeah, no, that's a very legitimate question because it's really just a big simulation.
Right.
But there actually is sort of a lack of empirical evidence that real financial incentives are actually needed to sort of elicit these cooperative behaviors.
Okay.
So it seems that simulating incentives for altruism, i.e. by telling individuals that results will be displayed to partners with whom they will have the opportunity to interact with again in a different environment, is actually sufficient enough to elicit the necessary motives and emotions of altruism.
It is interesting to hear about cooperation and the sex differences surrounding cooperative behavior from a sexual selection perspective, as this is something that we don't usually talk about. So from our conversation today, the factor of one's sex does seem to influence behavior in the cooperative context. I want to touch briefly on some of the possible explanations that researchers have suggested in the literature. Social role theory is one that's been talked about, and this refers to how behavior might be affected by societal gender roles through role conformity and repeated participation. So for example, males follow norms of competition and aggression, while females tend to avoid aggression and situations that are harmful to others and themselves. Others turn to a more evolutionary explanation, and this suggests that sex differences arise from distinct adaptive problems that males and females face. So an example of this is in mate choice. Females may tend to be more selective in their mate choice, while males have more competition with other males. So this is more nuanced than you might expect. Sex differences as well as context matters greatly for research, including procedure and how we interpret data. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Kaneki and Dr. Kim. We covered quite a bit today thanks to your guys' expertise and research in the field.
Thank you for having us. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. It was a pleasure.
Okay, so that's it for today, folks. We hope you guys enjoyed our episode of Psychology with M. Join us next week for a continuation of our cooperative behavior special. Until next time.